AITA for refusing to financially support my in-laws after they spent my husband's savings? When I met Mark, I was immediately drawn to his generous nature. He was the kind of man who would go out of his way to help anyone in need, especially those he loved. I admired that about him, his sense of loyalty, his deep love for family. He came from a tight-knit household, and despite the financial hardships they faced growing up, they seemed incredibly close. Family was everything to Mark, and I knew it would always play a huge role in our relationship. When we got married 5 years ago, I was excited about building a future together. We both had steady jobs, and with careful planning, we envisioned saving enough to buy a home, start a family, and build a life that would give us security and happiness. Our goals aligned, and we worked hard to make those dreams a reality. But there was one aspect of Mark's life that quickly became a source of tension between us: his family's constant financial struggles. From the beginning, I noticed that they seemed to rely on him more than most families would. Whether it was a missed rent payment, a medical bill, or even just splurging on something they couldn't afford, his parents and siblings always seemed to need something. And every time they did, Mark was there, ready to help, pulling from the savings account he'd worked hard to build up since his teenage years. I'll be honest, there were moments I questioned his choices. It made me uncomfortable to watch him hand over hard-earned money time and again. But I didn't say anything. After all, it was his money, and I didn't want to seem controlling or unsupportive. I told myself that he had a right to use his money as he wished. And I wanted to be understanding. Mark would always say it was just this once, or that they would pay him back. But deep down, I knew it was unlikely that money would ever return. Still, I bit my tongue. He'd built that savings account long before he met me. It was his rainy day fund, as he called it, and he had every right to decide what counted as a rainy day. I thought maybe it was my issue to work through, that maybe I needed to adjust my perspective on family and money. Besides, I wanted to show him that I respected his choices. In my mind, I thought it was something we could work around. But that changed recently, and now, I'm not so sure I can ignore it anymore. A few months ago, Mark and I decided it was time to look for a house. We'd been saving for years, both adding to the down payment fund, but his initial savings made up the bulk of it. I was so excited. It felt like a huge milestone for us, a symbol of the life we were building together. A place where we could settle. A home that would be ours. Then, one evening, Mark sat me down, looking visibly shaken. He told me he'd just discovered something that had blindsided him completely. His family, the same people he'd been supporting for years, had drained his savings account. Almost every dollar he'd saved since he was a teenager was gone. I could hardly believe it, and for a moment, I just stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. It turned out they hadn't asked him or even hinted that they planned to use the money. They simply accessed the account, withdrew funds for various emergencies and special occasions, and left almost nothing behind. And it wasn't even on essentials. They'd spent it on things like vacations, new electronics, and other luxuries they didn't need and certainly couldn't afford on their own. When I asked Mark how they had managed to take so much without his approval, he admitted that he'd trusted his family enough to let them have access to the account, assuming they would only use it if they absolutely had to and would ask first. But instead of treating his money with the same respect he'd shown them, they drained it, thinking he wouldn't mind. When he confronted them, they brushed it off, telling him they assumed he'd be okay with it, and that they meant to tell him, but figured he wouldn't mind. They were his family, after all. They acted as if it was just a minor misunderstanding. I was furious. They hadn't just taken a little here and there, they'd drained nearly every dollar. And they'd done it without even bothering to tell him until it was already gone. The money we'd counted on for our future was gone. And his family acted as if it was no big deal. As if his hard work and sacrifices didn't matter. I tried to keep calm as I listened, but I couldn't help feeling betrayed. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the sheer disrespect. The way they'd taken advantage of his kindness. They had relied on him repeatedly, knowing he would never say no, and now they'd gone too far. The money was gone, and with it, our plans for a house, our down payment fund, our dreams of a secure future. To make things even worse, not long after Mark found out about the missing money, his family came to us with another request. They needed more money to cover some unexpected expenses. They didn't even acknowledge what they had done or apologize for it. Instead, they acted as if it was our duty to support them, as if they were entitled to our help regardless of the cost to us. They had no remorse, no sense of accountability for their actions. I was done. I told Mark that enough was enough. We couldn't keep enabling this behavior, especially after what they'd done. I explained that this wasn't just about the money, it was about respect. About boundaries, about protecting our future. But Mark didn't see it that way. He felt guilty, saying his family was struggling, that they needed him, that we couldn't just abandon them in their time of need. Our conversation quickly escalated into an argument. He accused me of being cold-hearted, of putting money above people, of trying to cut him off from his family. He said I didn't understand how much he owed them, how he'd always been there for them and they'd always been there for him. I tried to explain that I wasn't asking him to abandon his family, I was asking him to set boundaries, to protect what we'd worked so hard to build. But he couldn't see it. All he saw was a family in need and a wife who was, in his mind, unwilling to help. He saw himself as the person holding his family together, the one who always had to step up, to be the hero, and he saw me as the obstacle standing in the way of that. I felt hurt, betrayed, and alone. How could he not see what they'd done to him? How could he not see the toll this was taking on us? On our relationship, on our future? I understood his love for his family, but I didn't understand his willingness to let them trample over us, to put their needs above our own. I knew we were at a crossroads. If we gave in now, this would never end. His family would keep coming to us, expecting us to bail them out every time they ran into trouble. And we would never be able to move forward with our own lives. We would be trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency, always putting his family's needs above our own. But Mark couldn't let go. He couldn't shake the guilt, the feeling that he had to be there for them no matter what. And I felt trapped, caught between my love for him and my need to protect our future, to set boundaries that would allow us to build a life together. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between us only grew. We barely spoke, each of us too hurt and angry to reach out. I knew he was struggling, that he felt torn between his family and his marriage. But I also knew that if we didn't set boundaries now, we never would. In the end, I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. I didn't know if I was being too rigid, too unwilling to compromise, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a line I couldn't cross. That I couldn't keep sacrificing our future for a family that had shown so little respect for us. So here I am, caught in a painful choice, wondering if I'm doing the right thing, wondering if I'm the one tearing our marriage apart. I love Mark, but I don't know if I can keep watching him throw away everything we've worked for, all for the sake of a family that doesn't seem to value him the way he deserves. In the days following our argument, I tried to wrap my mind around the reality we were facing. I wanted to understand why Mark couldn't see what was so painfully obvious to me, that his family had crossed a line that no one should cross. It wasn't just that they'd taken his money without asking, it was that they didn't seem to care. They didn't apologize or show any sign of remorse. They'd acted as if they were entitled to it, as if Mark's savings were there for the taking simply because he was willing to help in the past. For Mark, though, it was different. He carried this sense of responsibility that was so deeply ingrained. It was almost like a part of his identity. I could see that he was wrestling with himself, torn between his loyalty to his family and the life we were building together. He'd been raised to believe that family comes first, no matter the cost, and he couldn't bring himself to let them struggle. It was a mindset I respected in a way, even though it was difficult for me to relate to. I remember growing up in a household where independence was highly valued. My parents were supportive, of course, but they always emphasized the importance of self-reliance. They believed in teaching us to stand on our own 2 feet, to solve our problems without leaning on others unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't that my parents wouldn't have helped me if I needed it. It was more that they trusted me to be capable of handling my own life. So when I saw Mark's family relying on him to the extent that they did, it was foreign to me, even unsettling. But for Mark, it seemed as natural as breathing. Over the years, I'd watched him rush to their aid at the drop of a hat. Setting aside our plans, our needs, and our future, he'd pay their overdue bills, cover medical expenses, and even help them buy things that weren't essentials. And every time he did, I would try to be supportive, hoping it would be the last time, hoping that once he helped them get back on their feet, they'd finally stand on their own. But that day never came. Now, I was beginning to see that perhaps it never would. They had become so accustomed to his generosity, to his willingness to sacrifice for their sake, that they took it for granted. And the fact that they could take his money, our money, without even a word, without even a warning, made me realize that they had no respect for the boundaries I'd thought were unspoken but understood. To them, those boundaries didn't exist. One evening, I decided to try talking to Mark again, hoping that maybe, now that some time had passed, we could find a way to bridge the gap between us. I wanted him to see things from my perspective, to understand that this wasn't just about money but about respect, about our future, about the life we were trying to build together. Mark, I began hesitantly as he sat across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling on his phone. Can we talk about what happened? About your family, and about us? He looked up, a mixture of exhaustion and wariness in his eyes. I could tell he wasn't eager to revisit the conversation. But he nodded anyway, setting his phone aside. What is there to talk about? He asked. His tone resigned. You've made it clear how you feel. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my voice calm. It's not just about how I feel, Mark. It's about us. About what this means for our future. You're so focused on helping them, on fixing their problems, that I feel like you're forgetting about us. About the dreams we had, the plans we made. This was supposed to be our time to start building a life together. To buy a house, to create something that's ours. But they took that away from us without even asking. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. I know it was wrong. I do. But they're my family. They've always relied on me. And I can't just turn my back on them now. But Mark, I pressed, my voice soft but firm. At what cost? You've given them so much. And they keep taking. They keep expecting more. Where does it end? How much more are we supposed to sacrifice? He looked away, his jaw clenched, and I could see the guilt etched into his face. I don't know, he admitted quietly. I can't stand the thought of them struggling. They've had a hard life. And I want to help. I want to be there for them. I understand that, I replied, my voice filled with compassion. I really do. But there's a difference between helping and enabling. Right now, they're not learning to be responsible, to take care of themselves. They're just relying on you to fix everything. And it's hurting us. It's hurting you, even if you can't see it. For a moment, I thought my words might be getting through to him. He looked at me, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. And I felt a flicker of hope. But then, as quickly as it had come, that glimmer faded, replaced by the familiar stubbornness that seemed to define his relationship with his family. I can't abandon them, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're my family. They need me. I felt my heart sink. No matter how much I tried. He couldn't seem to understand that this wasn't about abandoning anyone. It was about setting boundaries. About creating a balance that would allow us to thrive without constantly sacrificing for others. The silence between us grew heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken words and unresolved tension. I realized then that this wasn't a problem that would be solved in one conversation. Or even in a dozen. It was something deeply ingrained in him. A sense of duty that went beyond reason. Beyond practicality. And as much as I wanted to support him, to stand by his side, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of resentment that was building within me. As the weeks passed, that resentment only grew. Every time his family called. Every time they asked for help. I felt a pang of anger. A feeling of betrayal. I watched as Mark struggled to balance his loyalty to them with his commitment to me. And I could see that he was tearing himself apart. He was trying to please everyone. To be everything to everyone. And in the process, he was losing himself, and we were losing each other. One evening, after another tense conversation about his family, I found myself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I felt trapped, caught between my love for Mark and my need for stability, for security, for a future that didn't feel like it was constantly slipping through my fingers. I knew that if we didn't find a way to set boundaries, to protect what we had, this would eventually tear us apart. But as much as I tried to convince myself that Mark would come around, that he would see reason, a part of me knew that he was too deeply entrenched in his loyalty to his family. He couldn't bring himself to let them struggle, even if it meant sacrificing our future. And I didn't know if I could live with that. The turning point came one afternoon, when his sister called, asking for help with yet another financial crisis. Mark was hesitant at first, glancing at me as if seeking my approval. But I could see the guilt in his eyes, the sense of obligation that he couldn't shake. I knew, without him even saying it, that he would give in, that he would help her, just as he always had. And that's when I realized that I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep watching him sacrifice everything we'd worked for, everything we'd dreamed of, for a family that didn't respect his boundaries, that didn't value the sacrifices he was making. I couldn't keep living in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing if our future would be secure or if we would be forced to give it all up at a moment's notice. That evening, I sat down with him again, feeling a mixture of sadness and resolve. I loved him, but I couldn't continue down this path if he wasn't willing to set boundaries, to protect what we had. Mark, I said, my voice steady but filled with emotion, I need you to make a choice. I can't keep living like this, always waiting for the other shoe to drop, always wondering if we'll ever be able to move forward. I need you to choose us, to choose our future, to set boundaries with your family. Because if you can't, I don't know if I can stay. He looked at me, his eyes filled with pain and uncertainty, and I could see that he was struggling, torn between his love for me and his loyalty to his family. I wanted to believe that he would choose us, that he would see the value in protecting what we'd built. But as the silence stretched on, I felt a sinking feeling in my chest, a sense of resignation that maybe, just maybe, I was asking for something he couldn't give. And as much as it broke my heart, I knew that I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness, my own future, for a life that felt like it was constantly slipping away. I loved him, but I loved myself too. And I couldn't keep putting his family's needs above my own, above our own dreams. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, I had to stay true to myself, to protect my own future, even if it meant walking away from the life I'd built with him. That night, the house felt unbearably quiet. After our conversation, Mark had retreated into himself, barely speaking a word, as if saying nothing could somehow keep reality at bay. I felt a mix of sadness and resolve, lying awake and wrestling with the choices that now seemed inevitable. The realization that my marriage might be over, that I might have to walk away from someone I loved deeply, felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. Days went by in a tense silence. I tried to go about my daily routines, to focus on work and keep myself busy, but it was impossible to ignore the distance between us. I felt like I was living with a stranger. Every time I looked at him, I saw the man I had fallen in love with, but that image was overshadowed by the conflict that had taken root between us. He was still the man who had made me laugh, who had held me close in the hardest times. But now, he was also the man who couldn't protect our future together. He was torn between the life we'd planned and the family that constantly needed saving. One evening, after another long day of strained silences and unspoken words, I decided to get out of the house for a while. I needed some space, some time to think. I called a friend, Sarah, who'd known me since college. She was one of the few people who knew the whole story, who understood the struggle I was facing. We met at a small cafe downtown, one of our favorite spots. Sarah looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and worry as I sat across from her, clutching a warm mug of coffee as if it could somehow ground me in the middle of the storm I was facing. "So," she said gently, her voice full of concern, "how are you holding up?" I managed a small smile, though I felt far from okay. "I'm surviving, I guess," I replied, shrugging. "It's been hard, to say the least. I feel like I'm losing him. Like I'm losing us." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you. But you've been patient, supportive, and understanding. You've tried to set boundaries. And they've crossed every one of them. Mark's family doesn't see the impact it's having on you both. Or maybe they just don't care. You have every right to feel the way you do. Her words were reassuring, but they didn't erase the ache I felt in my chest. It just feels so unfair. I murmured, staring into my coffee. I want him to be happy. I want him to be able to help his family if that's what he needs. But what about us? What about the life we've been trying to build? It feels like it doesn't even matter anymore. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, giving it a comforting squeeze. You deserve a partner who values your future together, who puts your dreams and your well-being at the center of your life. And maybe Mark isn't ready to do that yet. Maybe he's too caught up in his family's needs to see the toll it's taking on you. Her words hit home, resonating with the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind for weeks. I had been holding on to the hope that Mark would come around. That he would see reason. That he would choose our future over his family's endless demands. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that he might never be able to make that choice. And as much as I loved him, I couldn't keep sacrificing myself, my dreams, my future, for a family that saw our sacrifices as nothing more than a given. After talking with Sarah, I took a long walk through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, trying to find clarity in the stillness. The thought of leaving Mark felt like a weight in my chest. Something heavy and unavoidable, but the thought of staying, of continuing down this path of constant sacrifice and disappointment, felt even heavier. When I finally returned home, Mark was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands, looking lost in thought. For a moment, I felt a pang of empathy for him. A reminder of the man I loved. The man who was now so torn between the life we'd envisioned and the family who needed him. I knew he was struggling. That he felt trapped by his own sense of responsibility. And a part of me wanted to reach out. To comfort him. To tell him that everything would be okay. But I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Mark, I said softly, my voice breaking the silence. He looked up, his eyes filled with exhaustion. A hint of guilt lurking in their depths. Hey, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation I knew we needed to have. I need to know where we're going from here. I need to know if you're willing to set boundaries. If you're willing to prioritize us. Our future. He looked away, his expression conflicted. I don't know, he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I want to, but I can't just abandon them. They're my family. I've been taking care of them for so long. And I don't know how to stop. His words were like a punch to the gut. A confirmation of the fears that had been building within me. I'd hoped he would be willing to change. That he would see the importance of setting boundaries. But it was clear that he was trapped. Unable to let go of the sense of duty that had been instilled in him for so long. I understand that you love them, Mark, I said, my voice trembling. But I can't keep sacrificing my own future. My own happiness. For a family that doesn't respect our boundaries. I need stability, security, a future that we can build together without constantly worrying about your family's next crisis. He looked at me, his expression pained. I know, and I hate that I'm putting you through this. But I don't know how to choose. I don't know how to turn my back on them. The words hung in the air. A painful acknowledgement of the impossible choice he faced. I realized then that this wasn't just about money or boundaries. It was about who he was. The man he'd been raised to be. The man who couldn't separate his identity from his role as the family's provider. Their protector. And as much as I loved him, as much as I wanted to build a life with him, I knew I couldn't keep asking him to be someone he wasn't. After a long, painful silence, I spoke again, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we need some time apart. Maybe we need to figure out who we are. What we want. Without the weight of all these expectations. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked as though he wanted to argue. To tell me that we could make it work. That he would find a way. But then, he looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He knew, just as I did, that we were at an impasse. That we couldn't keep going on like this without tearing each other apart. Maybe you're right, he said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. Maybe we do need some time to figure things out. The decision felt like a knife to the heart. But also like a release. a relief from the constant tension and disappointment that had weighed us down for so long. We agreed to take some time apart, to give each other space to heal, to reflect, to figure out what we wanted. It was a painful choice, one that neither of us wanted to make, but we knew it was the only way forward. In the days that followed, I packed a few things and moved into a small apartment nearby. A place that felt empty but also freeing. It was strange, being on my own, waking up in a space that was just mine, without the constant weight of Mark's family's needs hanging over my head. I missed him deeply, missed the warmth and companionship we'd shared, but I also felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. Mark and I stayed in touch, our conversations tentative and cautious, each of us unsure of where we stood, of what the future held. He told me that he was working on setting boundaries with his family, that he was trying to find a balance that would allow him to be there for them without sacrificing his own life. I could hear the struggle in his voice, the pain of letting go of old habits and expectations, but I admired him for trying, for finally facing the patterns that had held him captive for so long. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself growing stronger, more independent, more certain of what I wanted for my life. I realized that, as much as I loved Mark, I couldn't go back to the life we'd had before, to the constant sacrifices and compromises. I needed a partner who could stand by my side, who could prioritize our future without being pulled in a million directions by the demands of others. And though I still loved him, I knew that love alone wasn't enough. Months went by, and the time apart began to reveal things to me I hadn't been able to see before. Living alone, I was forced to confront the parts of myself I'd neglected in my marriage. I'd spent so much energy fighting for Mark and for our future that I hadn't taken the time to consider what I wanted outside of that. The quiet of my new apartment, free of the constant hum of Mark's family drama, made space for me to reconnect with myself and reevaluate what I truly needed in a relationship. I thought about the kind of life I wanted to build. It wasn't just about having financial security or a clear path forward, it was about having a partner who could walk alongside me. Someone with whom I shared values and goals. For so long, I'd accepted Mark's choices without questioning what they really meant for us, thinking that, with enough compromise, we could find a way to make it work. But now, in the solitude of my own space, I began to see that compromise only worked when both people were willing to meet in the middle. Mark had started reaching out more often. Our conversations were careful and vulnerable, both of us treading lightly around the topics that had once been landmines. He told me about the progress he'd made with his family, how he'd started setting boundaries and making it clear that he couldn't be their safety net indefinitely. He even confessed that he'd found a therapist, someone who was helping him untangle the complicated emotions and sense of duty that had fueled his relationship with his family for so long. Listening to him, I felt a flicker of hope, a hope that maybe he was finally realizing what I'd been trying to tell him all along. But I was also wary. We'd been here before, with promises and intentions that faded as soon as his family's next crisis hit. I wanted to believe he was changing, that he was finally putting our relationship on equal footing with his family. But a part of me knew that only time would tell if these changes were real. One night, about 6 months after I'd moved out, Mark called me and asked if we could meet. He said he had something important to tell me, something he felt I needed to hear in person. I agreed, though my heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew this conversation would be pivotal, that it would determine the future of our relationship. We met at a small coffee shop near my apartment, a cozy place with dim lighting and soft music playing in the background. When I walked in, I saw him sitting by the window, looking down at his hands as he waited. He looked different, more grounded, somehow, and there was a calmness in his posture that hadn't been there before. It was as if the weight he'd carried for so long had finally started to lift. He looked up when he saw me, a small, tentative smile breaking across his face. "Hey," he said softly, his voice filled with a warmth I hadn't heard in a long time. "Hey," I replied, sitting down across from him, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, neither of us spoke, each of us taking in the other, the weight of the past months hanging heavily between us. Finally, Mark took a deep breath. his gaze steady as he looked into my eyes. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice filled with sincerity, "for giving me the space to figure things out, for showing me that I needed to make changes, even if it meant losing you. I don't think I could have come to these realizations without that wake-up call. It was painful, but it forced me to take a hard look at myself, at the choices I was making and the impact they had on us." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "I'm glad to hear that, Mark. I know it wasn't easy, but I had to do it. For both of us." He reached across the table, his hand hovering near mine as if asking for permission. I let him take my hand, the warmth of his touch familiar yet somehow different. "I'm not saying I've fixed everything," he continued, his voice laced with humility. "But I'm learning. I'm learning to say no, to put boundaries in place. I've told my family that I can't keep bailing them out, that they need to start taking responsibility for their own lives." Hearing him say those words felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. A small ray of hope piercing through the doubts and fears that had built up over time. But I also knew I couldn't let my guard down just yet. Actions spoke louder than words. And as much as I wanted to believe him, I needed to see if he could follow through. "I'm proud of you for doing that, Mark," I said, my voice soft but steady. "But I need to be honest with you. I can't go back to the way things were. I can't keep living in fear that every time there's a crisis, you'll put them first. I need to know that I'm your priority, that our future matters just as much as your family does." He nodded, his expression filled with understanding. "I know, and I don't expect you to just take me back without question. I know I have to prove to you that I can change, that I'm willing to protect what we have." For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would be okay, but it was a start. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward that honored both our love for each other and the boundaries we needed to protect. Over the next few months, Mark and I began to rebuild our relationship. Slowly and carefully, we spent time together, but I maintained my apartment, giving both of us the space to navigate this new phase with intention. I watched as he continued to set boundaries with his family, holding firm even when they pushed back. It was hard for him, I could tell, but he was committed to following through, to proving that he could be the partner I needed him to be. There were moments of doubt, times when I wondered if he would slip back into old patterns. But each time, he showed me that he was willing to fight for us, to make the choices that would allow us to move forward without sacrificing our future. And as he did, my trust in him began to rebuild, slowly but surely. One day, about a year after we'd first separated, Mark asked me if I was ready to move back in together, to start fresh with a foundation built on trust and mutual respect. I took some time to think about it, to make sure that I was truly ready to take that step. I needed to be certain that I could trust him, that I could let go of the past and believe in the future we were building together. In the end, I said yes. Moving back in felt both familiar and new. We were the same people, but we had grown, changed, and learned from the mistakes that had nearly torn us apart. Our relationship felt stronger, built on a foundation of boundaries and respect that had been missing before. And though I knew there would still be challenges, I felt confident that we could face them together, that we could build a life that honored both our love and our individual needs. Looking back, I realized that our time apart had been the best thing that could have happened to us. It had forced us to confront the things we'd been avoiding, to address the issues that had been lurking beneath the surface. And in doing so, we had found a way to move forward, not as two people sacrificing for each other but as partners building a life together. Side by side, Mark's family still faced their struggles, and there were times when they asked for help. But now, Mark and I approached those requests together, as a team, making decisions that honored both his love for them and our commitment to each other. It wasn't always easy, but it was a balance we were willing to work for. In the end, I learned that love isn't just about being there for each other in the good times. It's about being willing to fight for each other in the hard times. To make the choices that protect what you've built together. And though it had taken us down a painful path, that lesson had brought us closer than ever, giving us the strength to face whatever the future held, together. The months that followed our reunion were a testament to the work we'd both put in. Each day felt like a conscious choice to invest in each other. A far cry from the assumptions and patterns that had once held us back. As we moved forward, I found myself taking a new kind of comfort in Mark's presence. He was no longer just the man I loved, he was my partner in every sense. Someone who respected my boundaries as much as I respected his values. There were still difficult moments, of course. Old habits have a way of creeping back in when you least expect it. Sometimes, his family would call with a new issue, and I could see the struggle in Mark's eyes. The familiar pull to jump in and fix everything. But now, instead of acting impulsively, he would turn to me, asking for my thoughts, letting us decide together. Each time he chose to put us first, to approach the situation thoughtfully. My trust in him deepened. In turn, I found myself softening. With boundaries in place and my trust renewed, I was able to offer more compassion toward his family's challenges without feeling resentment. I understood now that, to Mark, family would always be a part of who he was. But our partnership was where he was planting his roots. That knowledge allowed me to release some of the tension I had held for so long. I could love and support him without fear that I would lose myself in the process. One evening, as we were unpacking boxes in our new home, a house we'd finally purchased together, a place that was truly ours, I paused to look at him. The man who had changed so much since the day I'd first met him. He glanced over, catching my eye, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Hey," he said, setting down a box and walking over to me. "What's going on in that head of yours?" I shook my head, feeling a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Just grateful. For us. For everything we've been through. For how far we've come." He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close. "I am too," he murmured, his voice soft and filled with emotion. "I didn't know if we'd make it. But I'm so glad we did." We stood there in each other's arms. The silence around us filled with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. In that moment, I knew we'd both fought hard to reach this place. We'd both sacrificed, compromised, and learned the importance of honoring ourselves as individuals so we could thrive as a couple. I felt a deep sense of contentment. A knowledge that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, we were finally on solid ground. Mark's family still played a role in our lives. But now, there were clear boundaries that protected our relationship and our future. With time, they'd come to accept those boundaries, respecting that Mark had chosen a different path while still remaining part of their lives. And though there were occasional tensions, it was nothing compared to the constant strain we'd once faced. We'd found a way to balance love, duty, and partnership, a path that honored everyone involved. One day, a few months after we'd settled into our new home, I sat down to write about the journey we'd taken, the hardships, the compromises, the triumphs. Writing had always been a source of clarity for me, a way to process my emotions and make sense of the world. As I poured my thoughts onto the page, I realized how much I'd grown, how much we both had. I realized that this journey had taught me lessons about love, trust, and resilience that would stay with me forever. The life I had with Mark now was not the one I'd once imagined. But it was a life we had chosen together. A life built on mutual respect and understanding. And as I closed my journal and looked around our home, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, for the journey, for the struggles, and for the love that had carried us through it all. In the end, we had found a new way to be together. A way that allowed us both to honor our pasts while creating a future that was truly ours. And as I looked toward that future, I felt a renewed sense of hope. Knowing that whatever came our way, we would face it together, side by side, as partners,